It's my enormous pleasure to introduce author of the John Lennon Series and co-host of the acclaimed podcast, She Said, Jude Kessler. Welcome, Jude.
Thank you, Colin. This is so great. I just was saying that I just saw your wonderful interview with May Pang, and you guys just hit it off. It was a great interview, and I'm really thrilled to be included on your show today. Thank you very much.
Well, it's our pleasure. We always get good feedback when we have May on as well. She's been on twice so far, and we've got one in the can, which will be landing in the next few weeks as well. So I understand that your series on John Lennon is now extending to 10 books, and we're now halfway through with volume 5, taking us up to late 1965. So you've lapped Mark Lewison several times over.
No one ever laps Mark Lewison. I mean, he is our Beatles guru, and we all know it, but I'm trying to put in the same amount of research and effort. I tell the story as if you're reading a novel. It looks, like you're reading a fictionalized account, but whatever the boys say, they said. What they're wearing is exactly what they wore, what they sing in studio. We're going by the book. There are over 4,500 footnotes in every book. So you're getting exactly what happened, to the point where we really get in the weeds. At one point, I tell the story of the boys landing in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, prior to their time in the Ozark Mountains, fishing and riding horses during that tour of 1964, the North American tour. And I talked to the three boys that accidentally chanced upon the Beatles getting off the plane in Walnut Ridge. They were out cruising on a Friday night after the football game, a winning football game, playing the radio and doing what teenage boys do. And they saw a plane land in the middle of the night and went to check it out. Now, the three of them told three completely different stories about what they saw and what happened when the Beatles got off the plane. And very few points of truth converge. So you take those points, you go from there, and then you interview the other people who were there and try to piece it all together. But that's the way it is with a lot of stories about the Beatles. In Canada, the boy that delivered their food right before the concert said he delivered hamburgers. And the promoter of the show said, oh no, they had fried chicken. So, I mean, sometimes you get in the weeds, but I try very hard to get to the nugget of truth in every story and then tell it as if you're there.
I think that came out in the anthology as well, when they were all relating the visit to Elvis, and all four of them gave a separate account. I think George didn't even remember jamming at the end, which all three of them said that there was anything they could agree on. There was some kind of jamming going on, and of course Ivor Davis gave a slightly different account, our mutual friend as well. So it's very difficult to get to the source, isn't it? With all these conflicting stories from different sources. Do you endeavor to use mostly primary and contemporaneous sources as much as you can?
I do, but they are usually the ones that remember it the foggiest. Because after all, if I said to you, now, Colin, go back and recount for me the events of last Tuesday, you're not going to remember exactly what happened. In fact, we were just speaking before the show started about the fact that our house flooded last week. And I remember in what I think is detail about where the water was coming in. But if you said, well, tell me what you had on and what did you have to eat that day? And what did you say when you first saw that water coming in? I don't know. That, sometimes the people that were there are the ones who remember at least, but the observers, like, for example, Ivor Davis, who was very carefully watching and remembering and listening because he knew he had to write a news story on it, remembers the details, I think, a little bit better than. Here's the conflict with the Elvis and jamming story. John and Paul stayed in the room with Elvis. Ringo went off to play snooker with the Memphis Mafia, or as Ivor says, the Memphis Mafia, in another room. And George went out looking for a reefer. So, of course, George and Ringo don't remember jamming with Elvis because they were no longer in the room. And John and Paul swear that they did, but they swear they did completely different songs. So it's very difficult. What I do, Colin, is I make a grid and I record every single account. I had 85 pages of typed notes on the night they met Elvis. And I compare every single account and try to find which one is the most plausible and who was really there and who wasn't. And I mean, Mal was there. Have two of the Memphis Mafia give their story. You put them all together and try to, but it's very difficult. It is really very difficult.
We're going to talk about Volume 3 in a minute, and particularly the recording of She Loves You at EMI Studios. You draw quite heavily on Geoff Emerick's 2006 book, Here, There and Everywhere. But that was quite controversial at the time, I believe, because there were a lot of factual errors in Geoff's account, and particularly from Ken Scott. Ken Scott has sort of commented that before Geoff wrote the book, he contacted him and other people and said he had a limited memory of the events and asked for his memory. So it's an interesting one. It's a great account as a session, but you do wonder how much of that is flawed memory.
Yeah, well, I do work. My main source, of course, is John C. Wynn, because John had all of the audio files and transcribed them. I mean, thank God for John C. Wynn. He is, as much as possible, has given us direct verbiage from the studio. He tells you where you can watch bootlegs of the sessions and hear audio tape. So Mark Lewison, John C. Wynn, sometimes Keith Badman, depending on what's going on. Of course, you're always going to take people like Hunter Davies and Bruce Feiser, and they're your standards. Geoff, you have to include your primary sources, but I do note that Geoff is very prejudiced against George Harrison. I mean, there's no doubt about it. He does not like George Harrison, and he's going to paint him in a bad light. And sometimes he gets details wrong. The time that the girl invaded the studio, he has the girl going for Ringo, and she went straight for John and was going to tackle John. And I say that in the notes. So, you try to balance everyone's account.
Maybe George didn't like the tie that Geoff was wearing, and maybe he remembered that, something like that. Now, in your latest venture, you've dived headlong into the world of audiobooks and taken a step back, returning to Volume 3, She Loves You, as we mentioned, covering the period April 63 to March 64. What prompted you to work in this format?
I had not really experienced audiobooks. And one day, I have a huge yard, about an acre of gardens that my husband and I maintain. And I was out doing what you do in the summer. You spend an hour at least a night watering plants. And I was out there and I received a message on Facebook Messenger from a gentleman named Scott R. McKinley, who said, I've just done an audio book for Jay Bergen's Lennon, the Mobster and the Lawyer. And I wonder if you give a listen and sort of give me, some feedback on it. So I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a shot. I'll see what this is like. And I can tell you, I love this book. Have you interviewed Jay, Colin? Have you had him on your?
I'm hoping to soon.
Yeah, he's great. He was John's lawyer in the Roots trial with Morris Levy. And he had all of this documentation, which sat in a file in his house, and he never did anything with it. And this is direct verbiage from John on how he creates songs, how he orders them on an album, why he thinks some songs are more important than others, what he loves to listen to. This is stuff we've never heard before. And I was fascinated by the book, but I didn't know about the audiobook. And I am very, very picky about people that do John Lennon. For example, recent videos of John Lennon make him out to be quite the buffoon. They don't ever show the serious John. They show John scratching his sideburns and clowning and dancing. And John was not a buffoon. He was a very intelligent, well-read, articulate, smart man. And I'm very picky about the way people portray John. And I started listening to this audiobook and I was like, oh my gosh, this isn't someone imitating John Lennon. This is John Winston Lennon. I mean, Scott McKinley had down his pauses and his, when John says no, he always goes, no, it's not in my book. He put it in there. And he is so good that I called him and said, can you do Paul? Can you do Ringo? Can you do George? What about Brian? And I did not give him the full disclosure, which was there are 183 voices, 183 in this book, which includes the Roy Orbison tour. You've got Bobby Goldsboro in the book. You have Sid Bernstein and Ed Sullivan and Cousin Brucey and Brian, Cynthia, Mimi. I mean, it's full of voices. And so he said, I think I'm up to the challenge. And he began to study them, and the rest is history. So may I have the pleasure of introducing the one, the only, the very talented Scott R. McKinley.
Well, thank you, Jude. And it's a pleasure to meet you, Colin. And thank you for having me on today.
It's a
And
pleasure, Scott. I mean, how much of a challenge was 180, more than 180 different voices? How long did it take you to study all the key voices to get them off
it
pat?
takes
And
quite a long time. I didn't
gosh,
know there were going to be that many when I decided to and said yes to doing this book. I knew it was a very long book and it was rich with dialogue, which I enjoy. And that actually is a lot easier to record than just straight biography, where you're not quoting sources from other books. You're actually putting in dialogue from interviews and things like that. It's much more fun to record as well. But it was at least 50 hours of research, I would think, just in listening to different audio clips that I have and different videos from YouTube, that kind of thing. I already knew most of the voices for the inner core of the Beatles and their attendants and that kind of thing. Brian and George Martin and all of that. But a lot of them are a little harder to find. Neil Aspinall's a pretty good example of somebody who's not interviewed all that frequently outside of anthology, for instance. But I did find some recordings of him talking in 1964 or 65. And when I was listening, I did try to focus solely on interviews from 1963 and early 64 because John's voice in particular would change as he got older, especially after he moved to New York, where the English accent wasn't quite so pronounced.
and which are the most difficult of all the accents that you have to deal with in the book? Was the Liverpudlian one the easiest for you, or did it come naturally? Or
Well, I didn't study Scouse particularly, although that is one way that voice actors do approach a very specific accent from a very specific country, if only because I was already very familiar with the Beatle voices. So what I tried to do instead was just to mimic as closely as I could the actual people talking rather than just the generic accent. And I think it helped quite a little bit to sort of focus in on it, if only because it's something that I'd done all my life as far as the Beatles go. I'm primarily a voice actor and narrator, and Beatles is just a side hobby. Getting to do Beatle books was something it was a dream. I didn't think I would get anywhere close to doing a book on the Beatles, at least not for a while. But it was certainly something I was looking forward to doing once that opportunity came up with Jay's book.
well, I admire the attention to detail because your voice, your Lennon voice in Jay Bergen's audiobook, quite different because we're talking about a much later period, and John's got more of a transatlantic twang in his voice there, so it's quite different
Yeah.
from 63, 64.
The one I was most concerned about was Cynthia, because I was like, if he can do John, and John has a deep tone to his voice, how in the world is he going to do Cynthia? And are we going to be able to have one narrator for this? And I asked him, I mean, Scott, can you record something that I can hear that Cynthia? And he put the pedal to the metal. Tell him how you captured that one, Scott, because you're quite good at Cynthia.
Yeah, I was nervous about doing Sin, if only because a woman's voice isn't too difficult if you're not trying to sound squeaky or sound Monty Python-ish, oh yes, oh, kind of thing. So, but doing Cynthia in particular, I was lucky to find a clip from 1963, I believe, of Cynthia actually talking to Julian in the crib, the year that he was born, and just talking with her. There was Julian, and she's got a slight lisp, not a very strong one. It's kind of adorable, actually, and so that was sort of a way into doing her voice in particular. Again, it was hard to find samples of Cynthia from back when. Most of the recordings of Cynthia or interviews with her, unfortunately, were around 1980, 81, and when she'd done her second autobiography. But I was lucky enough to find that online, and that helped. And
Well,
Jude seemed to like it.
the writing itself is immersive enough, but when you add it in the audiobook format, it's even more so. It's quite gripping, hearing the voices come over in that way. And Jude, what made you select volume three to be treated as an audiobook rather than the other ones that you've done?
We know from our studies of the best Greek writers that they always begin in media res, in the middle of the action. And then you can give a flashback. And that was Scott's idea. Scott said, let's not start people in the middle of the action without first giving them a glimpse of what's come before. So Prelude 1 is a 1-hour synopsis of the first book, which is should have been there, John's birth to December of 1961. And then Prelude 2 is a 1-hour synopsis of Volume 2, Shivering Inside. But when you begin the action, you are in the heart of it. Brian and John are on the Spanish Riviera for almost 2 weeks on holiday. And that is a crucial and probably the hardest chapter that I ever had to write, because there are 20 some odd accounts of what happened. And I had to put those together and come to, because even John gives you two complete different stories. You go on the Roy Orbison tour with the boys. They write She Loves You. And I have all sorts of documentation about the fact that they did not write it in one magical night, the night after the tour, that they've been working on it on the bus the whole time. And inspired and challenged by Roy Orbison, they're writing a song that's very much in the vein of Pretty Woman. And so we talk about, that John and Cynthia finally get to go on honeymoon to Paris. And there's that wonderful trip that they go on. Then in the autumn of 1963, Beatlemania breaks loose. They do Sunday night at the London Palladium, the biggest event in their career. I mean, they don't even know who this Ed Sullivan is. He's not as much on their radar as Sunday night at the London Palladium. Ringo's aunt used to say, play the Palladium and die. You've done it all. Then the Royal Command performance just a few days later. Then, the Christmas record, and going to Paris, and then coming to the US expecting nothing, thinking, look, here's our story. If we fail, we're going to tell everyone we just went over there to get records and hear the music. We're doing research if we fail. And of course, they do anything but fail. And there's the Ed Sullivan Show at Carnegie Hall in Washington, D.C. concert, and going to Miami. And I mean, it is a book full of excitement and a book full of the love of the Beatles. And they are happy and they are just loving this experience. And of course, in 64, they're still loving this experience. But by the time that we're up to the book that I'm doing now, the last book, Shades of Life, is 65, and they're doing it, but some of the thrill is gone, you know. So I love the happiness of 63, early 64.
Yeah, it becomes nuts later on, doesn't it? The craziness of all the gigs that they did in the States in '65 when it was dangerous for them and for the audience. And then obviously we come to '66 and the Maureen Cleave interview and all the controversy that stirred up in the States. It's quite a journey.
Yeah, my husband and I at Christmas time love to watch all of the little Hallmark Christmas movies, and we'll say to each other, things are going just swimmingly at the beginning of the movie, and we'll go, what's the complication going to be? Because this looks like it's going to work out great. And, invariably at 3/4 the way through, you have the complication. Well, into 65, 66 couldn't have been more of a complication. I mean, you have Manila and the controversy at the Budokan and John's statement being taken out of context. And I mean, it could not be worse. And they come to a great solution. The movie ends quite well because they go into studio and say, we're not touring anymore. Enough of this. We are going to become studio artists. And that's great for all of us. But wow, the summer of 66 probably couldn't have been any worse. I can't think of any way it could have been worse.
Well, let's return to that happy place of 63. And I
Yes.
believe Scott is going to read an excerpt now, which is going to demonstrate the full flexibility of his vocal training. So over to you, Scott.
There you go. Yes, I actually I have the book in front of me, and I did have a small portion to read. And it's interesting that you'd mentioned Jeff Emmerich at the beginning, since I believe that was probably the first audiobook on the Beatles that I ever listened to, was the audiobook for Here, There, and Everywhere, although it was abridged. And so, but it was very interesting, and it was well performed, and it sort of inspired some of the Beatle-y things that I was doing and about to do. So
You would expect an engineer to be the first to launch an audiobook, wouldn't you, really? So
I guess so. And that's something too that some people didn't realize when I was recording the audiobook. I do all the editing on it as well. And that takes far more time than just recording it goes. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes. But
tell me
I'm
about
going to read yeah, a portion from the recording of She Loves You. And it's just after the studio's been invaded by the girls, and they've just recorded one of the takes. And it starts with, Jeff Emmerich was still going on about the crack and percussion of She Loves You when the boys gathered at Studio 2's corner tea tray. John wanted to walk down to the canteen, but Neil advised against it. There's still scads of them outside, John, Neil scowled. Hundreds, and all that's between them and you's the front door and a measly handful of police. Is that so? John stared down his nose and wondered if this might not be a good time to reassert his command of things. Well, I think I'll go and decide for myself. You can't do that. Mal was genuinely alarmed. Get out of the way. John headed for the door, determined to take matters into his own hands again. What's eating him? Ringo poured himself a cuppa and reached for the white china sugar bowl and sugar shell. Him eating nothing? George guessed. How do you know what John thinks? Paul raised an eyebrow. Because George began, but before they could speculate further, John returned, clearly anxious. Mal, he barked. We need food from some nearby takeaway. Then he turned to the others. And as far as I can see, it's takeaways from here on out. We'll never get to the bleeding canteen again. It's not worth it. They're mad, those birds. Mal quickly scooped up his hat and keys and exited as John reached for a compensatory cup. I hope everyone's had enough sweet. Neil tried to lighten the mood, because here comes the balmy Scotsman and his yen for 16 sugar cubes. Irish, John corrected, and I take only the 5. Piff, Neil scoffed, waving John off. He'd seen otherwise. So, what's up next? Paul artfully directed them back toward the business at hand. Get you in the end, right? John turned his head sharply. No, he said with crisp clout. What's next is having me cuppa. Right, yeah. But after that, I mean, I'll let you know, John said. Once I'm done here, we'll play it by ear.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Scott. That was brilliant. I always wanted to close my eyes though, after looking at you, if you don't mind me being so rude, but it's hard hearing all those voices coming out of one mouth and sort of equating it. So in an audiobook, it works great.
Well, yes, I think it does. And I like the fact that with the dialogue, it almost sounds like an audio drama instead of just a plain biography. So you can sort of bring it to life a little bit. And I think that's better than just having someone read it, like just reading from a book. It keeps your attention. At least that's what I hope I've done.
Oh, you succeeded. No doubt, no doubt at all.
Thank you.
Jude, you visited Liverpool on many occasions to interview many of John's friends and family. Who provided you, do you think, with the most insightful testimony?
Ooh, that's a difficult and great question. Let me think about this for a second. Insightful. Well, insightful has to be, let me say before I say this, I had wonderful interviews from everyone. I was very fortunate because we went in 1993 to 2000 every year, and everybody was still around. Alan Williams was still around, and we got to be really good friends, and we were thrown out of a couple of places. So the Bard of Liverpool was in true form. Beryl Adams, who worked for Brian at NIMS and was married to Bob Wooler, was lovely, and I enjoyed speaking with her. We talked to Patty Delaney and Helen Anderson in her home in Chester, and Rod Murray, I could go on and on. Great, great people. But definitely my interview with Julia Baird a couple of years ago, because this was after she had spoken with Auntie Mater and was told the true story of what happened and why John went to live with Mimi and Uncle George. And no one knew this. I mean, when I wrote Should Have Been There, I didn't know this. I just knew that for very complicated reasons, Julia came back from taking her son back from Blackpool, and she took him directly to Mimi's house and left him with George and Mimi. But we didn't know why, other than things were complicated. Now we know that Pop Stanley mandated that that little boy was going to have a stable home, and he was going to go to his eldest sister, who would get him to school, make sure he did homework, go to Sunday school, go to church, do chores. That was the life that he wanted that only boy in the Stanley family to have. And Julia was bereft. I mean, she played a song every day about my boy John and wept. And she longed for him. She wanted him. If John had known that, history would have been completely different. I mean, we probably wouldn't have had, I've got every reason on earth to be mad because I just lost the only girl I had. We probably wouldn't have, I'm a loser and I'm not what I appear to be. So many of the songs we probably wouldn't have, because he would have felt loved instead of abandoned and rejected, and trying to prove that he was smart enough and good enough and capable enough, and somebody should have loved me. So that Julia's interview, which is on our She Said Podbean, is open and it's raw, and it's really a touching interview. I think that changed everything for me.
Did you ever get to meet or to interview Pete Shotton at all?
I did not, and that is a deep regret. I would have absolutely loved to talk to him. I've talked to almost everybody else. I mean, Rogue and Pete, all of the members, early members of the Quarrymen, Chaz Newby, people that really knew the boys well. And I tell you who was really one of the most helpful people, although he is not per se a Beatles intimate, but he knows the Beatles backwards and forwards, and he knows everyone who knows the Beatles, and that's Colin Fallows at John Moores University. I mean, Colin sat me down and said, get out a pen and paper. Here's who I want you to contact, and here are all their telephone numbers. And I mean, he sat there and just rattled off all of these people that he wanted me to call, including Arthur Ballard, who was alive at that time, John's professor who championed him at Liverpool College of Art. So he led me to Bill Harry and Johnny Guitar, so many people that Colin knew. And I owe him a great debt. I really do.
Yeah, it's so sad now. And obviously putting together this podcast, Words of Wisdom, there's so many people that have sadly passed away. So, a little bit envious that you got to them when you were still able to. It's a bit sad now, isn't it?
I had a wonderful, never to be forgotten afternoon on Lark Lane in Liverpool. We went to have lunch with Bob Wooler. And as we walked out after doing his interview, why? There stands Alan Williams. Oh, hello, Bob. Oh, hello, Alan. How nice to see you here. How about we all go to Keith's Wine Bar and talk? And we spent the next 4 hours in Keith's Wine Bar. And it was, I don't care that it cost $1 bazillion for all of the wine that we drank. It was a never to be forgotten afternoon and evening. And, I just feel very blessed that I've had these experiences.
And did Alan actually get his wallet out of his pocket at all?
Oh, no. In fact, just the opposite. He was trying to sell me a pair of leather pants that he claimed were Paul's. Maybe they were. Who knows? With Alan, you never know. And he had this letter he wanted me to read about the pants. Well, I read the letter and committed it to memory so I could use it later. But no, Alan, no. Alan was too busy getting everyone to sing the Welsh national anthem. So, Alan.
Well, I've never spoken to him, obviously, but you get a picture of people after a while. You read different accounts, and one thing that is consistent is Alan's always got some sort of dodgy deal on the go, hasn't he?
He does. He does. And I gave him the greatest idea. I said, Alan, you're a promoter. You need to do a Mimi run, the legendary supposed run that Mimi did from 9 Newcastle Road to the Oxford Langham Maternity Hospital. It's 3.2 miles. It's 5K. And I said, you need to get this going. This would be a big thing on the 9th of October. People could do this. It's a money-making venture. Now, he didn't want that. He wanted to sell me some leather pants.
Jude, thank you so much for sharing time with us today. And Scott as well. I really enjoyed that excerpt from the book. Absolutely fantastic. We'll get you on again, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Loved it.
Thank you very much, Colin.